It begins with a moment every parent has lived through and every parent fears. The instant you let someone you trust take your child for a weekend. The quick hug, the whispered be good, the reassurance from a friend that everything will be fine. A moment so ordinary it barely registers, until it becomes a moment you replay for the rest of your life. On March 15th, 2024, 3-year-old Harmoni Henderson, nonverbal autistic, and deeply attached to her mother, climbed into the back seat of her mother's car with no idea that this ordinary Friday would be the last day she would ever see home again. Her mother, Paris, England, had raised Harmoni with the intensity of a single mother who never had the luxury of turning off. Harmoni required constant monitoring, constant emotional reassurance, constant presence. Paris did it alone, every day. So when her closest friend, 30-year-old Aisha Harris, offered to watch Harmoni for the weekend, Paris finally allowed herself a breath. Aisha wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a babysitter pulled from an app or a neighbor someone vaguely recommended. She was a friend Paris called when she was overwhelmed at 2 a.m. She was a friend who lived close enough to show up quickly. She was a friend who knew Harmoni's routines, her triggers, her meltdowns, her little signals that meant she needed her mom. For 5 years, the two women had been inseparable. They watched each other's kids. They vented. They survived the hardest parts of motherhood together. There was never a reason to fear her. No warning sign that anything like this could happen. When Paris dropped Harmoni off, she believed she was doing what every exhausted parent is occasionally allowed to do: accept help. Aisha insisted she had everything under control. She even offered to keep Harmoni through Monday so Paris could rest. It was an act of generosity Paris desperately needed. But within 24 hours, that act of generosity would mutate into one of the most horrifying betrayals a mother can face. It started with a message. Aisha said Harmoni had fallen. Nothing major, she claimed. A little bump, a small cut, normal toddler stuff. Paris asked for pictures. Aisha refused. That was the first small tear in the illusion of safety. Paris pushed. A video call followed. On that call, Harmoni appeared alive. She wasn't energetic, but Paris, knowing her daughter's patterns, thought she looked tired, not dying. She was watching Cocomelon. She even pointed at the screen, something she only did for comfort. Paris hung up believing Harmoni was okay. She reminded herself that Aisha was her friend, her family, someone she trusted. But what Paris didn't know was this. By that point, according to prosecutors, Harmoni had already endured the first major trauma that would eventually take her life. Inside the Southfield Freeway home, investigators say Aisha had become frustrated. First with a long day, then with her own personal issues, and finally with Harmoni. They say she locked both children, Harmoni and her own 1-year-old, inside a bedroom for hours while she smoked marijuana with a friend. Prosecutors allege that when she returned and discovered Harmoni had vomited on herself, she snapped. In a rage, they say, she dragged the 3-year-old into the bathroom. She poured scalding water over Harmoni's head and face. Then, according to the prosecutor's office and her own admission to police, she slammed the child's head against the side of the bathtub. The injury to Harmoni's skull would become the fatal blow. None of this was known to Paris when she kept checking in. She believed her daughter was alive. Hurt, maybe, but safe. By the following afternoon, everything collapsed. Just before 2 p.m. on March 17th, Paris walked into Aisha's home and stepped into a nightmare she can still barely describe. On the bed, her daughter lay motionless. Not asleep, not resting. Motionless. Paris watched Aisha lift Harmoni's limp body and realized instantly something was horribly wrong. Her daughter's arm dropped lifelessly. Her head didn't move. Her face was still. Paris snatched Harmoni from her friend's arms and ran. She didn't wait for explanations. She didn't wait for paramedics. She didn't even wait for breath. She drove, faster than she had ever driven in her life, straight to the hospital, screaming prayers and commands for her child to stay alive. Inside the emergency room, doctors tried. They tried everything. But within minutes, Paris was told the words that would break her forever. Her daughter was gone. Later, Her father, Marquise, would read the autopsy report and struggle to say the words out loud. Blunt force trauma. A 3-year-old autistic baby. While Paris collapsed in grief, Aisha was taken to the Detroit Detention Center for processing. Police were already suspicious. The injuries didn't match the story. The burns were too severe. The head trauma too violent. The inconsistencies too obvious. That night, detectives pressed Aisha for answers. She shifted her story. She blamed accidents. She blamed hot water. She blamed a fall down the stairs. But investigators already had the truth. The water was scalding. The injury was blunt force. The timeline didn't match accidental trauma. Within days, Harris was arrested and formally charged with felony murder and first-degree child abuse. Prosecutors described the case as horrifying, senseless, and brutal. The medical examiner confirmed what police already suspected. The scalding burns were deliberate. The head injury was catastrophic. The death was homicide. But the story doesn't end there, because the interrogation, the polygraph, the shifting explanations, and the slow unraveling of Aisha's lies will reveal something even darker. Not just how Harmoni died, but how many hours she suffered while her mother was being told everything was fine. A mother's trust, a child's vulnerability, and a friend's betrayal. It is a story that leaves no one comfortable, because it forces a question parents never want to confront. How well do you really know the people you trust with your child's life? When detectives first sat across from 30-year-old Aisha Harris, they weren't looking at a stranger. They were looking at the woman who, just hours earlier, had ridden silently in a car with a dying child and the mother she had betrayed. And if there is one thing detectives in Detroit know well, it's that people who commit unthinkable crimes rarely walk into an interrogation room ready to admit what they've done. The first version of Aisha's story was delivered calmly, almost casually. She said little Harmoni had fallen down the stairs, an accident, a tumble. Kids fall all the time. She said she comforted her, said she watched over her, said she never hit her. She emphasized it more than once. But detectives already had the photographs from the hospital. Burns across the head and face, bruising, impact injuries inconsistent with a staircase, and the glaring absence of any attempt to call 911. No frantic emergency call from the house. No panic plea for help. Only a silent drive to the hospital after the child had already stopped responding. Still, detectives didn't push immediately. They let Aisha talk. They asked simple questions. Who was in the house? What happened first? Why didn't you call for help? And with each answer, a new contradiction surfaced. She said she smoked weed, but only a little. She said she wasn't impaired. She said she heard Harmoni fall, but didn't see it. She said she didn't want to take a picture of the injury for Paris because the child looked fine, even though the mother insisted. Detectives had worked cases like this before. They knew what they were seeing, a story built for convenience, not truth. So they brought her back the next day. This time, they told her they wanted to give her a chance to prove she was telling the truth. A polygraph examiner introduced himself, guided her through the process, strapped sensors to her body, and asked her simple baseline questions. Her voice trembled slightly, but she seemed confident, almost relieved, as if the machine could clear her name. But when the real questions began, the questions about whether she struck Harmoni, whether she hurt her out of anger, whether she pushed her, the physiological responses spiked. Her breathing changed. Her pulse surged. The lines on the polygraph screen moved in ways that told the examiner everything he needed to know. When the test ended, she looked at him desperately for reassurance. "Looking good," she asked. But it wasn't good, and she would learn that fast. The following morning, Aisha returned for a third interview, this time wearing the haunted expression detectives often see in suspects who realize the walls are closing in. She walked in asking for food, then said she wasn't hungry. She asked for crackers, then pushed them away. She laughed nervously. She cried suddenly. She rammed through emotions like she was trying on different versions of innocence. Detectives knew what was coming. They just needed her to say it. It began with hesitation, then deflection, then the first crack in the facade. "It was the water," she said quietly. "Maybe it was too hot." Detectives leaned forward. They didn't accuse. They didn't confront. They simply asked, "Tell us what happened in that bathroom." Aisha's voice dropped. She was moving around and she hit her head. But detectives needed clarity. A child does not receive catastrophic blunt force head trauma by moving around. They pressed gently, giving her every opportunity to explain in a way that aligned with the evidence. That's when Aisha finally said the words that shifted the case from suspicion to confession. "I pushed her down in the tub." There was a long silence. Detectives didn't rush her. She continued, as though the truth was forcing its way out in fragments she couldn't filter anymore. "She hit her head on the inside of the tub. I didn't mean to. I was frustrated. I was irritated. I was tired." She tried to minimize. She said it happened once. She said she stopped when she saw blood. But detectives already knew the autopsy showed blunt force trauma, severe enough to kill a child. They also knew about the burns, the temperature, the pattern. So they asked about the blood. She said she washed the bloody towel. Washed it so clean detectives couldn't locate it when they searched the house. She admitted she didn't call 911. Didn't tell Paris anything except that Harmony had fallen. Didn't mention the bath. Didn't mention the scalding water. Didn't mention the impact against the tub. It was in this moment, when the lies could no longer protect her, that Aisha broke down completely. She began shaking uncontrollably, not from grief, not from shock, but from the realization that the truth she had buried was now rising faster than she could contain it. "I'm a bad person," she whispered. "She died. Because of me. I didn't mean to hurt her. I was frustrated. I took it out on her, and she's gone." Detectives let her speak. The room fell quiet except for her sobs. Not the sobs of a grieving caregiver. Those detectives had heard before, and this wasn't it. This was the sobbing of someone whose excuses had finally run out. When she recovered, she asked to see the photos again. Images of the burns, the bruising, the tiny swollen face that told a story more honest than any witness. She stared at them for nearly a minute. "It didn't look like this," she whispered. "Not earlier. It didn't look like this." But detectives knew better. Her story had changed so many times that the photographs had become the only stable truth in the room. Then came the final moment of the interview, the one detectives never forget, because it reveals the suspect's true emotional horizon. "If you were my friend," Aisha said quietly, "please tell her I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt her." But the detectives refused to deliver her message. They weren't there to build bridges. They were there for justice. Within days, prosecutors elevated the case to felony murder and first-degree child abuse. Aisha Harris now faced the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison. Paris and Harmony's father were informed of the charges. They sat through explanations of autopsy findings that no parent should ever hear. Blunt force trauma, scalding burns, injuries inflicted behind closed doors by someone they had embraced as family. The truth was now irrefutable, and the legal battle was only beginning. But while the charges were serious, the next chapter would reveal a turn no one expected. The plea deal, the emotional courtroom confrontations, and the sentence that would define the rest of Aisha Harris's life. The charges against Aisha Harris were among the most severe the state of Michigan can file. Felony murder, first-degree child abuse, crimes that carry life sentences, crimes that prosecutors do not bring lightly. And as the case crossed from interrogation rooms into the legal system, the story of what happened inside that Southfield Freeway home would be examined under a microscope. Every injury, every hour missing from the timeline, every decision Aisha made while a 3-year-old lay dying in her care. For the Henderson family, time moved differently now. The world outside continued normally. Cars driving, people laughing, children playing. But inside their home, everything felt suspended. Harmony's toys were still there. Her clothes. Her favorite shows still autoplayed on her mother's phone, cued the way they were the days she left for Aisha's house. The silence inside the home contrasted violently with the chaos outside. Investigations, media coverage, interviews, and the sudden pressure of being the center of a tragedy they were never prepared for. As days passed, more details emerged publicly. The prosecutor's office held a briefing confirming what doctors already suspected. Harmony's burns were caused by scalding hot water, and her head injury was a result of blunt force impact. Assistant Prosecutor Jennifer Douglas described the case candidly. Aisha admitted to pouring hot water over the child and slamming her head against the bathtub. She also locked Harmoni and her own child in the bedroom for hours while she smoked weed with a friend. Investigators emphasized that no 911 call was ever made. Harmoni's mother had to drive her child to the hospital herself, long after the injury was fatal. In Detroit, people were horrified. Stories of violence against children were not unheard of, but this one felt like a betrayal from the inside. A best friend entrusted with child, a mother trying to rest for one weekend, and a little girl who could not speak to defend herself. Aisha was brought into court in handcuffs for her formal arraignment. The courtroom was cold, the way courtrooms often are, with a sterile quiet that makes every movement echo. She wore a jail-issued jumpsuit. Her hands shook. She looked smaller than she did in her social media photos, hunched, subdued, aware that the state was preparing to prosecute her for the murder of a child she had once called friend's baby. The judge read out the charges. Felony murder, first-degree child abuse. If convicted, she could spend the rest of her life in prison. Aisha said little, offering only short, whispered answers. She did not look at Harmoni's family, and they did not look away from her. Paris attended the hearing, her face drained but composed in a way only grieving parents understand, stuck between collapse and survival. As the months passed, the legal process slowed. Autopsy reports were finalized. Forensic analysis was completed. Statements were reviewed. Prosecutors built their case not on assumptions but on brutal, documented fact. Injuries too severe to be accidental, burns consistent with scalding water intentionally poured, a timeline that showed hours of inaction, and a confession acknowledging the fatal blow. But then, something unexpected happened. Aisha Harris agreed to a plea deal. After more than a year awaiting trial in the Wayne County Jail, Harris, now 31 years old, stood before Judge Kelly Ramsey and formally pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In exchange, prosecutors dropped the felony murder and first-degree child abuse charges. It wasn't leniency. It was a guarantee, a mandatory minimum of 28 years behind bars, with a maximum of 50. For the family, the plea brought mixed emotions. It meant avoiding a long, painful trial filled with graphic evidence and testimony. It meant avoiding months of reliving Harmoni's final moments under cross-examination. But it also meant accepting that the person who caused their daughter's death would one day walk free. The courtroom was packed the day Aisha was sentenced. The tension was palpable, tight, suffocating, the kind of tension that comes only when a community gathers to face the aftermath of a child's death. Aisha sat beside her attorney, her shoulders slumped, eyes downcast. The judge asked whether she had anything to say. She did not speak directly. Instead, her attorney read a prepared apology aloud on her behalf. It was a short statement, a quiet expression of remorse, a wish for forgiveness, a claim that she took the plea to spare the family the agony of a trial. It sounded like sorrow, but sorrow is complicated in the shadow of violence. Then the judge allowed the family to speak. Harmoni's grandfather, Darrell England, stepped forward first. His voice cracked as he spoke about the little girl with the bright smile, the girl who loved cartoons, the girl whose short life had been taken for reasons no one could understand. He told the court that no number of years would ever balance the scales. Next came Harmoni's grandmother, Shariria Cooper Lovelady. Her voice was soft but firm, carrying the weight of every sleepless night since March 2024. She told Aisha plainly that forgiveness was not something she could offer. Not now, not for a long time. Only God can forgive you, she said. I can't, not yet. Then came Paris. She stood at the podium, hands trembling, but her voice did not waver. She spoke to the judge, not the woman who had taken everything from her. She described the trust she once had in Aisha, the nights they spent talking, the memories they shared, the bond she believed they had. She talked about Harmoni's autism, how her daughter was nonverbal but expressive, emotional, loving in ways only her mother truly understood. She described the last moments, the video call, the limp body in Aisha's arms, the drive to the hospital where she already knew her daughter was gone. Why? She asked, tears breaking through her voice. Why would you do this to her? To me? My baby was 3. 3. The courtroom fell silent. Aisha did not look up. She kept her eyes fixed on the table, her fingers squeezing together until they turned white, as though gripping the last fragments of a life she could never return to. Judge Ramsey spoke next. She reviewed the facts, the burns, the head trauma, the delayed medical care. She read from the police reports, describing the injuries that no child should ever endure. She acknowledged the family's grief and the severity of what Harmoni suffered. Then she delivered the sentence. 28 to 50 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections. There was no applause, no sigh of relief, no sense of victory. Only a quiet acknowledgement that this was the closest thing to justice the legal system could offer. Aisha was let out of the courtroom in handcuffs, disappearing behind a door that slammed shut with a metallic thud. Paris remained standing, tears streaming silently down her face. She had waited over a year to hear the words guilty. She had waited longer to hear any explanation at all. But nothing, not the conviction, not the sentence, not the apology, could bring back the child she once tucked into bed each night. The child whose arms went limp at her own. The child whose laughter used to fill their home. The case was closed. The killer was in prison. But the story was only entering its most painful chapter, the aftermath. The holidays without Harmoni. The toys that would never be played with again. The sudden emptiness of a mother's life. And yet, through the grief, one question still lingered in the shadows, unresolved and haunting. How long had Harmoni been suffering before help arrived? And could she have been saved? Long before courtrooms and sentencing hearings, before the polygraph and the confession, before the news cameras and the headlines, there was a stretch of time no one witnessed. Hours inside a quiet Detroit home that would become the most disturbing part of the entire case. The period in which 3-year-old Harmoni Henderson lay suffering, unseen and unheard, while the woman responsible searched for ways to explain the unexplainable. Investigators reconstructed these hours with painful precision. They pieced together phone records, digital timestamps, prosecutorial findings, Aisha's shifting statements, and medical conclusions. What emerged was not a single moment of violence, but a timeline of neglect, where every decision Aisha made widened the gap between harm and help. To understand how this happened, investigators looked backward to the moment Harmoni's mother, Paris, hung up from that final video call. Harmoni had been alive, tired, perhaps, weak, but alive. She lifted a finger and pointed at the cartoon playing. She looked toward the screen, doing the one thing she always did to communicate comfort. Paris saw no emergency, no red flag strong enough to override 5 years of trust. But what she didn't see, and what investigators later confirmed, was that the fatal injury had already occurred. According to prosecutors, the bathtub blow to Harmoni's head caused a critical trauma. The burns from scalding water worsened her condition. These were intentional actions, not accidents. And the most devastating element wasn't just the violence. It was the silence that followed, because after those injuries, Aisha didn't call 911. She didn't call for medical help. She didn't call any adult family member. Instead, the timeline shows that hours passed. Not minutes. Not a brief panic. Hours. During that time, the household was eerily quiet. Aisha's friend had left earlier in the evening. Her own small child was in the home, unaware of what had taken place in the bathroom. And Harmoni, a nonverbal 3-year-old with limited ways to express pain, was left to deteriorate. Investigators believe she was conscious for at least some of this period. Based on the injuries described by prosecutors and the autopsy details shared with media, she likely experienced disorientation, swelling, and burning pain. Her body responded in ways the medical examiner later identified as consistent with both trauma and thermal injuries. But the only person who could help her, the only adult present, did nothing. Paris continued checking in. She sent messages. She called again, wanting reassurance. She asked if Harmoni was in pain. Aisha answered no. She told her everything was fine. She discouraged further calls, saying the little girl was resting. Those final calls now carry a weight that Paris cannot escape. Her daughter was dying, while her trusted friend was insisting she was chilling and watching cartoons. This information did not surface until much later, when police questioned Aisha about why she failed to call for help. She said she didn't think it was that bad. She said she didn't know the water was too hot. She claimed she thought the child was simply sleeping. But investigators knew from experience and from evidence that these explanations were incompatible with the severity of the injuries. The medical examiner's findings were clear. Burns significant enough to blister, and a head injury powerful enough to cause catastrophic internal damage. These were not injuries that mimic sleep. They were injuries that produced unmistakable signs of distress. Paris's father, Harmoni's grandfather, later recounted reading the autopsy report and being unable to speak. "A 3-year-old autistic baby," he said. "Blunt force trauma." The confusion and disbelief in his voice captured the reality that families of child victims often confront. The knowledge that someone had the chance to save their child and didn't take it. The timeline sharpened further when investigators analyzed the physical space. The Southfield Freeway residence was small, not the kind of home where a child in medical crisis could go unnoticed. A bathroom only steps from the bedroom. A hallway leading to the living area. No walls soundproofed. No reason to miss the signs. But the hardest truth investigators faced was this. Harmony's survival window may have been larger than anyone realized. The blunt force trauma was fatal, yes, but timely medical intervention, CPR, emergency response, immediate transport, might have changed the outcome. At the very least, her suffering would have been reduced. She would not have had to wait, unattended, while the biological consequences of her injuries progressed. Instead, Aisha washed the bloody towel. She changed the bedding. She rehearsed explanations for the bruising. She constructed stories about stairs and accidental falls. By the time Paris arrived the next day, the outcome was irreversible. The moment she walked to the bedroom doorway and saw her daughter's limp body on the bed, she felt something mothers often describe instinctively. Not fear, not confusion, but certainty. A knowing so sharp it split you open. Paris grabbed Harmony and ran, blood rushing through her ears, heart pounding so hard she could feel in her teeth. She lifted her daughter's body, crying out her name, begging for movement. But when the little girl's arm fell limp, Paris knew. At the hospital, the medical team tried. They pushed. They pressed. They attempted resuscitation with a determination that comes from knowing a child is involved. But nothing reversed the damage. Harmony's death was declared, and Paris collapsed. What the family didn't learn until later was the exact nature of the timeline, the hours between the injury and the death, hours that might have changed everything, hours that transform a tragedy into something darker, a preventable loss compounded by choices made in fear, rage, and denial. When investigators confronted Aisha with evidence of the timeline, she struggled. She cried. She denied. She said she didn't think Harmony needed help. She said she panicked. She said she was lazy after smoking. But through all the explanations, one detail cut through. She never called for help, not once. The legal system considers both action and inaction. In this case, both were devastating. As prosecutors prepared for trial, the timeline became one of the most important pieces of the case. It showed not only violence, but extended neglect. It showed intent not only in the injuries, but in the cover-up that followed. It showed a betrayal so deep that Paris would later stand in court and say she could never understand how her closest friend could take her daughter's life. And yet, despite the confession, despite the evidence, despite the emotional statements from Harmony's family, one final chapter remained. The outcome of the plea deal, the sentence handed down, and a question that continues to haunt everyone touched by this case. Why didn't she call for help? For 14 months, the Henderson family lived inside a tension that never loosened. Each court date, each hearing, each delay felt like a wound reopening. They entered the courthouse clutching photos of a little girl with big eyes and a shy smile. Photos taken before the burns, before the trauma, before the betrayal no one saw coming. Every appearance by Aisha Harris reminded them that they were looking at the person who'd been trusted as family, the woman who once held Harmony on her hip and joked about the chaos of motherhood. Now, that same woman sat behind a defense table, wearing shackles and a jail jumpsuit, facing charges that carried the possibility of life behind bars. The case was strong. The autopsy was clear. The confession was recorded. The timeline was damning. And the prosecutor's office, led by Wayne County Prosecutor Kim Worthy, would prepare to take the case to trial. But trials are brutal. Trials drag families through every photo, every injury, every detail of a child's final moments. And the Henderson family had already survived more than most people endure in a lifetime. So when prosecutors presented a plea agreement, a guaranteed conviction for second-degree murder, the family agreed. Not because it brought peace, not because it felt like enough, but because it meant they would not have to sit through the horrifying evidence at trial. They would not have to listen to experts discuss the temperature of the water, the force of the head trauma, or the biological sequence that led to their child's death. They would not have to endure hearing a defense attorney try to reinterpret brutality as accident. It would spare them from reliving the worst day of their lives in a courtroom filled with strangers. May 29, 2025, Detroit's Frank Murphy Hall of Justice, a date the family had circled on every calendar. This was the day Aisha Harris, now 31, would finally be sentenced. Courtrooms feel different on sentencing days. The air is heavy, as if everyone present understands they are standing at the edge of something irreversible. For the defendant, it is the end of life as they knew it. For the family of a victim, it is the end of a long path toward justice, but the beginning of the lifetime that comes after. Aisha entered the courtroom escorted by deputies. She didn't smile. She didn't look toward the gallery. She kept her head down, hands cuffed at her waist. Her attorney whispered instructions she barely seemed to hear. She looked small and nervous, but not the way an innocent person looks. More like someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Judge Kelly Ramsey took the bench. Her tone was calm but unwavering. She reviewed the plea. She confirmed that Aisha understood the consequences. 28 to 50 years in prison, with a mandatory minimum of 28. No early release. No reduction. No guarantees beyond what the law permits. Then she asked if Aisha wished to address the court. Aisha didn't speak. Instead, her attorney stood and unfolded a piece of paper. He read the words Aisha had written the night before, words that trembled with a mix of regret, fear, and the sudden awareness of the life she would now spend behind bars. I pray for peace and for healing for everyone's heart, he read slowly. Most of all, I pray for forgiveness for the pain that I have caused you. If I could rewind back today, I would. I took this plea in the hopes of sparing the family the pain of a trial. Paris, please find it in your heart to one day forgive me. I will forever be broken. I'm sorry. Her voice never filled the room. Only her words, spoken through someone else. Then it was the family's turn. Harmoni's grandfather stepped forward first. His voice was strong, but every sentence carried the gravity of a man who had spent months trying to understand the impossible. He spoke of a little girl who loved cartoons, who was gentle and sweet, who had a smile that lit the room. He described how he had read the autopsy report and nearly collapsed. A 3-year-old autistic baby, he said, shaking his head. Blunt force trauma. He looked at Aisha and asked a question no one could answer. Why? Why would you do this to her? Next came Harmoni's grandmother, Shariria. Her voice wavered, but her message was firm. She told Aisha that forgiveness was not something she could offer. Not now, and not for a very long time. Only God can forgive you, she said. I can't. Not yet. Her grief filled every corner of the room. Then Paris stood. The courtroom went silent. She walked to the podium slowly, as if each step required strength she wasn't sure she had left. She looked at the judge, then at Aisha, her former best friend, the woman she had trusted more than anyone outside her immediate family. And she spoke. She talked about Harmoni's life. The challenges, the sleepless nights, the meltdowns only she could calm, the routines that helped her navigate a world that often overwhelmed her. She explained the bond she shared with her daughter, one built on patience, love, and the unspoken communication that often exists between mothers and nonverbal children. She recounted the final video call, the last time she saw her daughter alive. She described the fear she felt the moment she lifted her daughter's limp body from Aisha's arms, the frantic drive to the hospital, the moment doctors told her Harmoni was gone. Her voice cracked, but she didn't break. Why didn't you call 911? She asked through tears. Why didn't you help her? Why did you let her suffer? You were supposed to be my friend." Her words hung in the air like a weight no one could lift. Aisha looked down. Her hands trembled, but she didn't answer. She couldn't. When Paris finished speaking, she returned to her family. Her legs seemed weak, but her resolve was firm. She had said everything a mother could say. Judge Ramsey delivered the final statement. She outlined the brutality of the injuries, the hot water, the blunt force trauma, the inaction afterward. She acknowledged the family's grief and the magnitude of harm done. Then she pronounced the sentence. 28 to 50 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections. Aisha Harris bowed her head as deputies moved in. Handcuffs clicked, chains tightened, the courtroom doors opened, and she was escorted through them, vanishing from sight as the door closed behind her. For the Henderson family, justice was done. But justice is not the same thing as healing. Justice does not restore the laughter that used to echo in their home. It does not bring back the 3-year-old who should have started kindergarten, who should have learned to speak, who should have lived a full life surrounded by the people who loved her from the moment she was born.